traffic when we come into the office every day. So
Yeah, it's like you said yesterday, right? You're feeling good to sit in traffic.
I've never wanted to sit in traffic before, but at least we see there's some demand. So
Yeah. Well, since we're just chatting, I sort of started the recording early. We'll still give it a few minutes, before we do our introductions. But since you wanted the video on and people in and participate, and I went ahead and just started letting people in. Normally, I hold them in the waiting room until right at 12 o'clock. But why not let them in and just facilitate some conversation, right?
Khalid, where are you from? What's your background?
I'm from Tunisia, if you know it.
From where?
Tunisia.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. I'm process engineer.
Okay. Where do you live now?
I live in Tunisia. Yeah.
Oh, do you really? So this is truly an international call. How is the market there? Is it just dead in the water?
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same. We are suffering.
Do you work at a refinery?
I work at an offshore facility.
Okay.
Khalid has been on a lot of the calls or a lot of the webinars that I've done, and always has good questions and participates and is really kind of up to speed with what we're talking about. A lot of them haven't really been market specific, more like this conversation, but along the lines of the new technology that we talked about from GE. The slug catcher training, I think, was the first one you probably were on, right? And then he's just stayed steady from there. I think we're connected on LinkedIn and communicated that way. So it was pretty cool.
With the series.
Hey, Bob, welcome. I don't see your camera on, but I see you. And CJ, welcome. I think it shows you're connecting.
Hi, Adam. Good to see you.
I have your question from LinkedIn, Bob, so we'll make sure to get to it.
Oh, thank you.
Although you can probably ask it now. We're opening up the chats a little bit compared to when we're doing the regular, sort of technical lunch and learn. So that's good.
We could give it a minute.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that came out of the last meeting, John, was how you really find out in this mobile environment if you need a meeting or not. I've been doing, this is 7 or 8 of these virtual lunch and learns, if you will, and there just really isn't anything that can replace the face-to-face interaction or the body language that you see when you're presenting. We interact that way a lot. I talk with my hands a lot. I'm used to standing up in front of people, and when I've been doing these technical lunch and learns, it's been pretty silent on a few questions from Khalid here and there, and Bob asked one on this one already, but the questions have been pretty light, and so I've just found it interesting that I think it's a lot of times easier to just feel more comfortable to ask those questions in person, I think, and I think we're all getting used to that. It's
funny you talk about that. We have a partner, a potential partner, a gentleman that lives in Bermuda. He's an oil billionaire. He was best friends with the Sultan of Oman. His name's John Doyce, and John and I talk twice a week from his compound in Bermuda. He also has, just to give you an idea, 93 acres at the base of Jackson Hole Mountain, where he spends part of the year there. But his take was a little bit different, Adam, in the sense that he doesn't think that we'll see as many meetings scheduled face-to-face that require travel. And it's interesting, I've got another friend that's the Vicar General for the Archdiocese of Denver, the Catholic Archdiocese, and he says, I will never go back to the schedule that I used to maintain. He said, I had so many unnecessary meetings that I'm not going to go back to that world again. So yeah. I think we'll probably, given what's going on in terms of travel, we'll see less travel. I think you may know, I used to fly 150,000 miles a year to all the General Electric plants in the U.S. And, this is pre-cell phone. This is the late 80s, pre-GPS. I think that people are finding that for what they really need, perhaps in a business meeting, it can be accomplished on Zoom or on one of these platforms. So I think a large part of that will be that people just want to avoid travel and getting in an airplane. So,
well, and my family is pressuring me to be home. They've really enjoyed my time here, and I've enjoyed my time being at the house and seeing my 4-year-old and my 1-year-old do what they do more often than not.
No question. I think we need to ask people to go around and drive around at night.
Yeah,
So they're
totally.
consuming our products.
Totally. Well, hey, we're up to 15 or so participants here, so let's, and it's 12:03, so we've given it ample time so we can get started. First off, thank you everyone for joining us. I know a lot of you all are on mute. I am going to go through after this introduction and unmute you all. And please feel free, if appropriate, to turn on your video. John likes seeing interaction and, really likes to know who he's talking to. And you're welcome to interact here and ask questions and do what we need to do. I have some set questions, but it's all fair game moving forward. So I'll go ahead and do that. But first, let me introduce John Harpole. Thank you for joining us. John is the founder and president of Mercator Energy. They're a natural gas services, brokerage, and energy market analysis company. So in his career, John has provided strategic advice and counseling to a lot of independent oil and gas producers that you probably know and have worked with, power producers, electric and gas utilities, hedge funds, energy traders, pretty much every market in the energy sector. And typically works at the CEO level, which is, really why I found it so interesting, is because we want to find out how people are adapting to this and what we're looking at moving forward. And John can be a good singular source of that. So he's played a key role in business structures and assisted energy policy on multiple levels. And so thank you, John, for coming in, and appreciate you just having this conversation with us.
My pleasure, Adam. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
So let's get started. First off, let me just ask a little bit about Mercator. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
You bet. We're a 26-year-old company this year. In the late 80s and early 90s, I was a natural gas buyer for General Electric. As I mentioned, I flew about 150,000 miles a year to General Electric industrial plants. And on behalf of their sister company, that was a production company located here in Denver, I would show the GE plants how to purchase natural gas in the new unbundled world. So I got a firsthand look at the deregulation of natural gas transportation in the U.S. And more often than not, our GE plant was one of the first industrial facilities behind a utility grid, pipeline grid, that was buying gas from a sister company and shipping it through the utilities pipeline rather than purchase the gas directly from the pipeline. So 26 years ago, I started this company with literally $5,000. And now we manage about 2 billion cubic feet of gas per day. I've got just 5 full-time employees that do nomination scheduling, that sort of thing. But we handle anywhere from an ammonia plant, as an example, down in Louisiana that buys 100,000 MMBtu a day, to sugar beet plants all over the West that buy gas to process sugar beets into sugar. We've got EOR facilities in Bakersfield, California that we buy natural gas for. But 70% of our business are really dry natural gas producers, or I say not oil wells that have associated gas, but dry natural gas producers in about 6 states here in the West.
Excellent. So broad knowledge, hopefully, learning a little bit about the different basins. That we'll get into that with Bob's question here, but let's get started on kind of how did we get here, right? Today oil sits at about 23.90, or was this morning, the WTI. Natural gas is at about $1.85, $1.86, something like that. Both of those off 52-week highs of $63, $64, you know, and $2.65 respectively. You know, we understand the COVID, the lockdown, all the demand that's gone away, but you know, how did we get here? What are we doing with this thing?
I think the best way to describe that is to share a story. I've been invited 2 or 3 times now over to China to teach members of the Central Party Pricing Committee in China, so the Communist Party, how our natural gas system works, but primarily members and employees of PetroChina, so that they better understand kind of our capitalistic way of moving natural gas. When I was there, the country manager for EOG had a concession in China, actually said that he put it so well, so succinctly, so basic, just so much common sense. He said, John, for the first 40 years of my career, we would search for oil and gas in the nooks and crannies where it leaked out of the source rock. And he said, we're now simply drilling into the source rock, fracking it and producing it. And so the mystery about how to find the oil and gas is gone. And that reality has created a superabundance that we really don't have to worry, nor do our grandkids have to worry about the supply of oil and natural gas. We know where it is, and so now it's just a manufacturing game. And so when you impact the way that COVID has impact the demand by a factor of 30%, when the world is consuming 100 million barrels a day, a 10% decline or 9% decline by OPEC countries just doesn't address the demand destruction that we've seen. And I think the real question, and to kind of get ahead, I think, of Bob's question perhaps, we have no idea how we're going to come out of this thing. You have different analysts that are all making different prognostications, but one of them said, look, a 36-month recovery means that we're in a few weeks, we're at 96 million barrels a day of demand. 93 million barrels a day of demand, and 96 million barrel a day demand in 3 weeks mean we only have an 18-month recovery. We've got to get over the overhang. We've seen a lot of refineries across the country, you know, 4 specific ones down in the Permian that are only processing 60% of what they had historically. So the companies that are levered, that have a high debt to equity ratio, are the companies that are going to be involved in some kind of merger and acquisition. And I wouldn't call this a natural life cycle because I don't think COVID-19 is really natural, but it's something that we're going to have to brace ourselves for. We've seen a 60 to 70% to 80% drop in the frac crews in individual basins. But through the course of this, we're going to see winners and losers. And, you know, that's why I really wanted the microphones turned on. I think we've got, 15, 20 people that are as much an expert in this industry as I am. And I'd love this, really turn this into a conversation.
Yeah, to that end, we'll just go ahead and ask Bob's question since it does touch in on that, right? So, losing 60 to 70% of the frac crews is significant, but how have you seen each basin respond to the shut-ins, as a ranking from first to last, or sort of as an order of priority for a comeback, gas versus oil, or what are you hearing from your connections as far as that goes, where they might be looking next or recovering next?
I think you got to beware. Everybody always talks up their own book. And my book, for the most part, are dry natural gas producers in the West. And so there may be a factor where I'm trying to come up with a silver lining story for my producers, but I think it's a reality. So essentially, the short story is we're seeing associated gas production in the Permian, the Denver-Julesburg Basin, and the Bakken drop off significantly with the oil shut-ins. And we think that oil shut-in issue will continue to grow over the next 3 to 4 to 5 weeks. With that, we're seeing a significant volume of natural gas that's historically competed with Rockies Mountain natural gas in the Mid-Continent market and the California market. We're seeing it just not show up. And so we've seen the price differential to the Rockies gas drop or narrow significantly over the last 2 weeks, and we expect it to continue, perhaps even go positive by the time we're in the middle of the air conditioning load this summer. So let's just look at it for a second. We know that we've lost about 800,000 to 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas, associated gas production in the DJ. We've lost at least that much associated gas production up in North Dakota. That seems to be accelerating. And the prediction is that we'll lose, there's about 12 BCF a day of associated gas production in the Permian. We'll probably lose anywhere from 4 to 6, and some people are even saying 8 BCF a day, because there just simply isn't anywhere to put the oil. And so as a result, the producers are being forced to shut in. It's interesting, the Texas Railroad Commission took up the argument as to whether or not they should enforce and implement prorationing rules. And on May 5th, just a day or so ago, they decided not to even tackle that because it's a moot point. I mean, the producer has to shut in because there's no place to take the oil. So within the energy spectrum, we see winners and losers. Some of the winners may well be the producers of gas in the Rockies. So let's say New Mexico, Northwest New Mexico, San Juan Basin, Southwest Colorado, Piceance Basin, all the basins up in Wyoming that produce gas primarily. You know, the associated gas that comes out of the Uinta Basin may still be there. So it's not just all bad news for the energy sector.
I want to touch on a point you just brought up. So, you know, we all know that hedging goes on, you know, and certain companies are advocating for those, you know, Texas Railroad Commission cuts, which got voted down. You know, but if companies are hedged, you know, do you think they should be limiting production at this point? You know, are there other options?
It's really a larger question for me. I think that in this superabundant world of oil and gas, thanks to the United States, I see this as competition between our capitalistic method on a global scale, our capitalistic approach, and the approach of the national oil companies that may not be forced to be efficient in other countries as a publicly traded company in the Permian Basin might. And so I don't want to see the U.S. lose any kind of market share, because I think the efficiency that's brought out by our capitalist approach is the reason why we have superabundant energy now. I mean, I would say the unique feature in the U.S. is simply this private property ownership of minerals that's unique to any other country. There's no other country that you can have private property ownership of minerals. And despite what President Obama said, it was the arm's length transaction between an independent oil and gas producer and those mineral owners that really created the energy revolution, the energy shale revolution here in the U.S. And so I think if you're Russia and you're Saudi Arabia, you're hoping that Texas will proration so that you can control all of these, what they would refer to as one-off companies that are slowly taking their market share over the last few years. But I don't want to surrender our style of life and our approach to business to some national oil company in another country that's, again, perhaps not as efficient as we are as independents here in the U.S.
Right. So to that end, you know, that arm's length transaction, right? And you work with a lot of the smaller independent companies, which tended to be more leaning toward the free market, especially here in Texas, whereas some of the bigger companies have come out, you know, and been in favor of it. Are you starting to see, or do you feel sort of a big, you know, conglomerate versus this small independent sort of back and forth, or you know, is there any animosity building in that there, you know, in this industry that you're seeing?
The independent group that supported proration in Texas in a number of papers was described as a vocal minority. Yeah. There was a great op-ed piece this morning about Don Quixote, and you know, the Texas Railroad Commission was the equivalent of Don Quixote just fighting against windmills. I'm just a firm, huge believer in free markets. And I think we experience free markets more so here in this country. And the free market will probably dictate better than a room full of regulators.
Yeah.
I think some very good friends were some of that vocal minority down in Texas. But I think when I've argued with them about this democracy versus socialist approach, let's say, to a national oil company, or some national oil companies may have, they kind of back away from their argument. What they're trying to do, quite frankly, is preserve jobs. And if they see a pro-rationing effort as a way to preserve jobs and get ahead of it, but there was just no getting ahead of this COVID demand destruction. So,
To that end, do you have any expected changes from all this? Whether it's workers not coming back, mobile working. I know sort of the bigger companies have promoted this CO2 tax and throwing a lot on the wall here, but what sort of changes do you think might get pushed through both positively and negatively because of this downturn?
so I have a good friend. I've been through so many downturns in the oil and gas industry in the last 40 years that when I'm upside down, my head doesn't turn blue anymore. You've seen prognosticators again say that people that are making $100,000 a year that lost their job will throw away the keys and not come back to the industry. And I just don't see that. I always hear that story, but I've never seen it to be the reality. I called Chris Wright, who runs the Liberty Fracking Group here in Denver, about 2 weeks ago, just to check in. He's a good friend. And, he laid off nearly, I think, half of his staff. My right-hand person is married to one of the heads of the frac crew at Liberty. And what's intriguing is that, they fired several hundred people. Chris said he got more than 25 thank you notes from people who were fired because they said it was the best job that they ever had. And so the concept behind hedging, actually I talked to Pat Burrow at Great West Oil and Gas. Pat's hedged 120% at $53, something like that in the DJ. So he's still getting the checks on the settlement, but again, he doesn't have any place to take the oil. And so I don't think that there's one complete answer that says, yes, we've lost another generation of people for the oil and gas industry, because when the industry comes back, these are terrific jobs. And the people who enjoyed the job when they had it will come back to the industry. But we need, even beyond the hedging, we need some kind of predictability and assurance that demand is there. You have up in Canada right now, Trudeau and all the politicians are arguing whether or not the Canadian oil industry is over. And there are certain people that want to see the demise of our industry. You've got 40 US legislators right now that are proposing that no oil and gas industry participants should get any kind of assistance from the government simply because of their green nature, their green background. You've got folks arguing up in Canada right now that they should just segue all the unemployed heavy oil workers up there into the green industry. But the reality is that our commodity is so fungible and so efficient that it can't be replaced, and we know that. So more often than not, we don't even engage in the discussion with some of these people that can only be described as nuts.
I've been communicating with a few people, and there seems to be a consensus out there. I brought up the big versus independent, or the pro-rate versus non-pro-rate, or all of these different views on our industry. And the theme seems to be, from a lot of my circle, is that there's not really a front runner leader talking about our industry on a massive scale. Electric cars have Elon Musk. There's just a variety of different industries that kind of have their leaders. Do you think our industry is sort of suffering from some of that, and the sort of old look at that we all compete, and nobody really wants to share any of those trade secrets, but we all need to work together, right?
Well, I used to love Ken Lay at Enron. Obviously, before they got into so much trouble, because he got such a great spokesman for our industry. My uncle was very, very close to Boone Pickens, and Boone was up to a certain point a great spokesman for our industry, and I just don't see it. I've got a very close friend, Robert Bryce, who writes all about renewables and how the predicted scale of renewables just doesn't work, does not work. I really think we need a voice that explains issues to people, to the basic common sense nature of people, saying, no, you cannot switch to an entire green revolution overnight. Robert was saying, that this expected COVID problem is going to cost our nation $3 trillion spread out over several decades, probably. Well, this conversion that AOC is talking about is a $16 trillion conversion within a couple of years. So it just emphatically, it cannot happen. And again, people unfortunately don't understand scale. And I don't necessarily blame our industry and not educating people, because I had another friend on the left say, you have to ask sometimes for permission to educate people. And quite frankly, Adam, I don't think some of these people want to be educated on the harsh reality of what the world is.
Right. Yeah, it just seems to be a glaring piece that our industry is sort of missing. And
I think we're all too busy.
Yeah, well, that's, they say.
And that's a poor excuse. But again, I think the effort's been made. But I always love to say that Independent Association of America, Independent Association of Oklahoma, Texas, you name it, Independent Association is an oxymoron. And it's because we all have our own firm beliefs and ways to approach business that I think we're successful. So by nature, it may be tough to come up with, the next Boone Pickens or the next Ken Lay. But, maybe Scott Sheffield, a pioneer, is one of those. I really agree. I find myself nodding with most of the things that Scott said. So,
yeah. This low price environment has to affect consumers, though. I mean, and that has to play a role in at least some point of, a lot of people vote with their wallets, right? So leading into this election, we might have historically low gas for our cars and heating for our homes. Do you see that playing a driver moving forward?
So I've been for 20 years quite an advocate of low-income energy issues.
Yeah.
Only to find myself on an Energy Outreach Colorado board where there are only 2 or 3 conservatives out of a group of 20. And so my belief is that inexpensive natural gas prices since 2008 have hidden the true cost of the renewable energy that's been assumed and brought into the electric sector or into the electric side of the bill for a low-income household. But the real pain of that higher cost for electricity has not been felt because natural gas has been so inexpensive. And it's been interesting, a lot of the fellow board members that I had, I'm no longer on that board, were really social justice warriors, always campaigning for better CO2 and climate change issues. But at the same sense, when I asked for assistance in some of the regulatory legislative issues here that would hurt oil and gas in Colorado, they said that they couldn't help because they had to be unbiased. So it's I could do a whole nother lunch and learn on the impact of our industry on low income households. But for me, the key to achieving, maintaining, and holding the moral high ground is to point out to people that there's a disproportionate amount of income spent by a low income household on energy. And this oil and gas industry in the US is the absolute best friend of the low income household, whether they realize it or not. We did a study at Mercator about 4 or 5 years ago at what the average savings was for a household in the US, just a household in the US, based on hydraulic fracturing and what that had done to create the energy shale revolution. And we came up with a number that was reported in the Wall Street Journal and then Fox News of anywhere from $1,200 to $1,800 a year per household. I've seen other studies that says it's $3,000 a year. Well, take a look at these costs of natural gas and gasoline and imagine the household savings for a house, again, that spends a disproportionate amount of income on energy. And again, I think that is the target for our education effort, is that low-income household. But you have a situation, again, because I grew up in a low-income household. My mom didn't care or couldn't afford to care about climate change, even though it wasn't an issue back then. She was worried about trying to figure out how to put bread on the table and not advocate for some social justice issues. So again, maybe Adam, that's another whole nother lunch and learn, but we've got quite a bit to say on how we impact low-income households.
Sure. We've had a couple questions pop in on the chat that I'll ask. We're about 30 minutes in, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And if you can't open up your voice chat, I think I set it up to be automatically off. But if you can't open it up, just message me. I'll open it up and you can ask your question. So first off, that report that you just referenced, is that still available or easily findable on Google? Or
I'll tell you, I'll find a link to it and send it to you. And it's just, we should probably update the current price strip so that we can compare it against. We essentially compared what was the cost of energy and natural gas in 2006, 7, and 8 versus post shale revolution, and it'll be easy to update. We found a very good friend in Steve Moore at Steve was on the editorial page or board at the Wall Street Journal. Steve picked up on our press release, actually wrote a big column about it in the Wall Street 5 or 6 years ago, and then actually pushed it into Fox News. Steve also wrote about it in his book that it was released about a year ago. But Steve is a guy that spends 2 or 3 days in the Oval Office, 2 or 3 days a week. He's just the right-hand guy to Trump's economic advisor. So,
excellent. That's a good connection to have.
yeah, he's been become a wonderful friend.
Early on, we were throwing out a lot of numbers, and the question relates to forecasting the supply. So, certain forecasts are starting to look at, rising crude oil prices potentially by even the fourth quarter. You had mentioned, like a 93 or 96 month recovery, or can you just go over those again?
The one report I saw said that an 18-month recovery
yeah.
means that we immediately jump up to 96 million barrels a day of demand worldwide. A 36-month recovery means we only get to 93. So we're seeing a lot of demand for all the products, for distillate, for ethane, propane, gasoline, obviously diesel. So we see the world kind of coming back, and you can see that if you've driven, any time in the last month. The traffic is much heavier right now, at least in Colorado, than it was certainly 2 weeks ago. But the question is, somebody pointed out that the herd reaction to COVID-19 hasn't happened yet. And that for most of the countries, you've only seen about 5% infection rate. Now, there's a lot of debate over that. So there's a concern among some docs that this might come back in 2 months when we all start acquiring or reducing that social distance. But
right.
For me, it's only a projection right now. I think all of the projections that I've seen have been grossly overestimated. If I can, just for a second. So I convinced my oldest daughter to come home from Cleveland, and I wrote up a sheet. I don't even know. I might try to just show it here, but it shows the population of Denver and how many people might be infected. And then it compares that to the number of beds that might be available. And so imagine that 6 weeks ago, the experts were quoting that there'd be a 2% death rate in Colorado. There'd be an infection rate of 60%. This is in the midst of all of the supposed proclamation of social distancing. We haven't seen either one of those, but they were projecting at that time a shortfall in beds of 28,000 beds. And yet I've got friends who work on the front line in a number of different hospitals that say the hospitals are just empty. This is an interesting time to trust people who are so adamant about how accurate their projections are. And so I am extremely hopeful that we'll be back to that 96 million barrel a day number, and that we'll see a positive response, more so than all the people that are arguing that this is going to come back and hit us again. If I could just tell one other story. So I've got a son that's kind of a he's an 18-year-old. He's a national bass fishing champion. He won a bass tournament up in Idaho last October. And so he won a trip for the two of us to go down to Brazil and fish for peacock bass on the Rio Negro River. So we were down there the last 2 weeks of January, and with one of the doctors that's the head of the level 2 trauma hospital down in Pueblo, Colorado. So a top ER doc in Colorado. And the coronavirus story was just breaking as we were flying back from Manaus, Brazil, onto Miami. And I turned to Matt and I said, Matt, you know, do you believe this? And he said, oh my God, we're as a country, he goes, I guarantee you we're going to completely overreact. He said, because of sequencing now, we can identify where a virus comes from. And he said, and I promise you, no more people are going to die from this than they would from the flu. So, you know, Matt's prognostication back in that third week of January has been really, really accurate. So again, I hope that so much of the concerns are overstated and that we recover.
Well, are you hearing anyone in our industry start to discuss that if the world can be shut down on predictions that are so incredibly wrong, or at least seem to be, you know, and our industry is very affected by analysis that can tend to be so incredibly wrong, right? Do we, or is anyone feeling a threat of a climate emergency shutdown? You know, they've just shut down the world, so it can be done, right? And that
I saw a photograph that because of social distancing, you know, our local reservoir that's obviously landlocked has seen the return of orcas. That's a really bad joke. I mean, there's clearly no killer whales in Colorado, but this whole notion, I mean, this is an opportunity for the Greens to make a case that is just not supportable. And I think we need to respond with the argument that Robert Bryce has that, you know, the new green world that AOC envisions could be 10 to 20 times more expensive than this and literally shut down a way of life that we've all come to know and love.
Yeah.
So that argument, I think, can go both ways. And we need to really be vigilant about, I mean, imagine right now 40 legislators, US congressmen and senators, that would support legislation that would say that no oil and gas industry, individual or company, would receive any assistance. So it's just, they don't understand what runs the country.
Right. Question came in. What's your take on bankruptcies moving forward? You know, their impact and potential volume of those.
So there's over $200 billion of debt that's due, payable within 24 months across our oil and gas producer sector. There are companies who have a debt to equity ratio that exceeds 50%, maybe 60%. And so I think in about 8 months, we're going to see a lot of merger M&A work. You're going to see companies declaring bankruptcy. You're going to see an impact on midstream companies, MLPs, who are only as good as the credit of their shipper or their partner in moving gas. There's going to be a real shakeout. There were, as one friend said, just too many good ideas the last 5 years that so many investors came in. And so you're going to see a whole shift in valuations down and bankruptcies that occur that will be reorganized at the expense of a lot of downstream entities' credit worthiness. So
Interesting. Thank you for that.
it's inevitable.
Yeah. Well, guys, I want to open it up to more questions. Does anybody have anything else they want to ask John?
I had one more question, John. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much. One thought is, as the wells get shut in and that whole phenomenon kind of persists, and I know there's a whole guessing game of when they come back on, what's your take on when they come back on, what the kind of disruption to those specific wells, what that looks like? And I know that's a well dynamic question, but do you have an opinion or kind of thought on that?
You know, I get asked questions like that a lot. I'm sure we all do, about give an answer that means the average. But what we'll say, when you talk to, say, Bernadette Johnson, who I think is one of the best analysts out there, she was at Bentech. She's now at Drilling Info. You know, producers, as you know, a producer will have 30 wells in a field, and 6 of those wells perform better than the other 24. And so I think what's going to happen is that you're going to probably turn on your better wells. So there's going to be a production spike in response to any kind of move. As I understand, there aren't that many DUCs out there drilling but uncompleted. And with the frac count in terms of frac rigs that are out there, frac crews that are out there dropping, I think that you're going to see production come on for the better wells. But it's going to be the better wells and the better basins, but only by the producers who have a debt to equity ratio that's not as horrible as some others have. And so the response will be somewhat measured. And so, Bob, I guess the answer is really a non-answer. It's just a much deeper answer than just watch the Permian turn on first or the DJ next. I mean, I would guess that there are some really troubled producers in all of these associated gas oil basins. And so you're going to have issues, and then you have the M&A stuff work out. You can see the creditors committee start negotiating with the downstream folks to get out of what they believe is an exorbitant transportation to haul product somewhere, either gas or oil. So it's just going to be, I think it's going to be a longer recovery to get to where we were, but maybe a shorter recovery than the worst people are prognosticating right now, because the healthy producer is going to turn on the healthy well. And you're going to see that happen and activate. And the dry gas producer who hasn't hired a rig in the peons, you may see the peons rig count go from 1 to 10 within 8 months. You may see issues related to, say, Jonah Energy or Ultra up in Southwest Wyoming that they may turn on or may not turn on, depending upon how their bankruptcies work out or how their debt issues work out. So there's just going to be some pain all up and down the scale, from the producer to the end user, or the producer to the refiner or processor or interstate pipeline. But I think you got to look at it company by company within the company within the better wells within the field. So sorry for the non-answer, but I think that you understand what I'm saying.
It makes sense. So from a service provider standpoint, we want to make sure we're doing work with the best leveraged companies, essentially.
Yeah, there are. I mean, I pulled up a list of the people that are highly levered. You know, the Williams Company have a debt to equity ratio of 62%. SM Energy has a 50% debt to equity. Noble, 50%. Oxy, 50%. Kinder, Class B, 50%. Antero, 50%. We're talking about some really heavy-duty players. But what's interesting is that, you know, if the price on gas runs, and I'm predicting a natural gas price for the Rockies next winter, probably 50 cents higher than it is right now, so it'll be trading above $3. You're going to see all sorts of machinations. I mean, my billionaire oil trader friend down in Bermuda, I said, aren't you glad you're not trading oil in this craziness? You know, he's 76 years old. He said, no, John, we love volatility. So if you really understand what's going on, it's a good time to buy specific stocks or play certain markets. And I think each one of us has that kind of insight. It's a good time to take a look at what that insight really means to your own portfolio, I believe. So,
Point. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Bob, to parlay on your question a little bit, there's been a variety of different things thrown around in Texas as well. I mean, as far as which ones they're shutting in, right? Like if you have a flare, might be first on the list. I know that, you know, any well pads with flares are like that's one proposal out there. Others are ones that you have to truck that aren't, you know, connected to midstreams and things like that. So it'll be curious to see which choices are made, right? Well, everyone, I want to thank you guys for your time. John, specifically, thank you for coming on and just having this little chat with everybody. I've asked all the questions. Unless anyone has any more, we'll let everyone get on to their lunch. And thank you again.
Guys, all have a good Friday and a good weekend. Take care. Be safe.
Take it easy, guys.
You too. Thanks, guys.